This is Delegate Brian Crosby from St. Mary's County, the Mother County, and you're listening to the Conduit Street Podcast, the best source of information on what's happening in Annapolis.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson. Michael, it's Thursday, April 28th. How's it going?
Doing okay. We're back to a remote recording, but I love this idea of clicking through a bunch of issues from the legislative session that's just a couple weeks behind us. So did round one last week, and I want to talk about labor education stuff this week. I'm looking forward to it.
Today we have with us special guest Brianna January, MACo policy team member, and I think as Michael alluded to a little bit, her policy portfolio includes education, schools and capital facilities, employee benefits and relations, business affairs, and more. Brianna, thank you so much for joining us. We're looking forward to this talk today.
Yeah, I am too. I definitely was not busy at all this session.
Yeah, none of us were. So today, to set you up, Brianna, we're going to get into paid leave, school construction, education, community colleges, a bunch of different topics here. And I want to start with one of the most intriguing bills of the session, and that's the passage of a program to establish a statewide paid family and medical leave program, FMLA. Brianna, there was a lot of back and forth here. Walk us through the process, the bill, what's in the bill, what's not in the bill, and take us through sort of how we got there. I know there was a veto that was overridden.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start off strong here. So paid family and medical leave, or FMLA, as you indicated, Kevin. This has been a topic that's been on everyone's radar in the state for a few years now. So nothing shy for us as a body, nothing shy for the legislature, that's for sure. But this session was really unique. There was a ton of back and forth on the issue. We essentially opened the session knowing that both chambers wanted to do something on paid leave this year. But we didn't know exactly if they were on the same page, and they didn't seem to know either at first. It was honestly a difficult issue to follow as it was bouncing back and forth, as many things are during session, but this one being particularly complicated. And then of course we had the calculus of what leadership wanted to do during an election year and a high profile session. So a lot of back and forth. Both chambers really started the session pretty strong, introducing bills that would fully establish a paid leave program. However, by mid-session or so, we really started to see a divide in the plan and what strategy they were going to take. The House, about mid-session, took a large step back, for example, and decided that, the best move, instead of passing a full bill to establish a program, was actually to pass a commission to study the details of how to actually best implement a program in the state. And, instead of leaving those details up to the legislature, they wanted an independent body, a commission, to really hash that out.
Some of that was due to the pandemic, right? I think there were some arguments that, hey, the economy is a lot different. We know that businesses are struggling. And some of this, we need to take it to a study, was partly at least due to the pandemic. That's what we heard, right?
Absolutely. That wasn't out of nowhere. That was based on feedback. It was based on real concerns from various communities and leaders. And so that's where the House started to move. And there was actually what I thought was a pretty well done explanation on the floor of how this was the smart, timely way to go about this. But then just maybe a week later, the Senate actually moved forward with their full bill to really flesh out a more established program and not just continue to study the issue. And within days of the Senate passing that version, the House actually came back and said, you know what, we're actually going to go ahead and do something more than just our commission. And they quickly passed the Senate's plan. So lots of bouncing back and forth, lots of moving targets. But by the end of the session, we did have both chambers in agreement passing the same version of a bill to establish a program that leaves a lot of the details still to be determined, which I'll get into soon. But as expected, that bill, after being passed, was vetoed by Governor Hogan, and then the legislature was still in session and overrode that veto. So we do have something on the books now to establish a program, and I'm happy to get into what those details look like if y'all are ready to.
I think what's interesting here as you talk about creating a program that for people who haven't followed this issue, the last couple of years have pointed in a particular direction for how Maryland might proceed with family leave. And it's a little different than the last time state leaders sort of asked the business or employer community to do things differently. I mean, a number of years ago, the state sort of accelerated its own state minimum wage. And that was basically, this is what private employers need to do. You need to pay this wage, period. And this is an obligation directly on the employer. This idea of family leave, Brianna, is really, it's a little bit more like the way we do unemployment insurance, that rather than the individual employer or business is responsible for paying your personal benefits as an employee, if you need to go out on leave, you for yourself or for a family member, instead, everybody pays into sort of a big trust fund or a big central program, and the benefits come from that central program. It's a different concept than just, hey, everybody go pay this wage. So that's what we mean by creating a program as opposed to just imposing a new mandate on employers. And that's the model that we've got, I guess, at least the architecture built for. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So this is actually called an insurance fund for that reason. And it's designed to be distributed and maintained by the state, and to then distribute to individual folks who are looking to seek the benefit. And so the bill that did pass would establish that insurance fund, if you will, with contributions starting from both employers and employees in October of 23, and with that benefit being available by January of 25. And that benefit would include up to 12 weeks of paid leave for medical reasons for the employee or for someone in their family. But it also would include an additional 12 weeks for things like new births or adoptions, for example. Something that's really interesting here about the bill that they did pass is that so small businesses are exempted for the most part. Employers with fewer than 15 employees will not have to contribute to that insurance fund. But the employees of those small businesses, every employee in the state will still have to contribute. So that's really interesting. The fund essentially, all of the larger employees then are essentially subsidizing smaller employers, I mean.
I think that's important because there was a lot of talk about, well, if I don't want to do it, if I don't want to pay into this program and I don't want to take the leave, I should be able to opt out. But as you both said, this is similar to insurance, right? Where you can't just have, like you're talking about health insurance, you can't just have all the healthy people or the sick people, either one of those groups being on the planet. You have to have a mix, right? Because that's what it's all about. And it's the same thing here, right? You can't have people opting out because then the whole thing falls apart. You have to have enough people to keep this program stable, paying into it. And then most employers are going to pay into it. But that was part of the debate is, well, why does everybody have to do this? You don't have an option. And it's because if you don't have everyone participate, the program sort of falls apart, right?
Exactly. And also to that note, it's just like health insurance in the sense that you never know when you're going to need to take that benefit. So the idea is that up front, everyone contributes and then it's available if you need to take it in the future. Something that's really interesting, though, about that here and about the contributions of both the employers and the employees in particular is that this bill that was passed leaves those exact details up to a study to be completed by the Department of Legislative Services on exactly what that contribution rate, what that split should be. So we don't really know what it's going to look like, how much employers will pay compared to employees. That is to be determined. And I'm saying that with emphasis on the fact that the contributions are set to start next October. So not much turnaround there. So to be determined what that will look like. But for local government world, we definitely know that there will be some sort of contributions that we have to adhere to, as well as obviously honoring the eligible leave requests when that time comes. And that's going to be particularly interesting, I think, for some of our more special categories of employees, if you will, such as public safety staff, folks that we want on on call all the time. And so kind of navigating as the managers and the hiring bodies, how do we make sure that we're both able to properly give that leave that is eligible and needed, but also making sure that we fill all of our services as required in our duties as local governments. So a lot of details still to come here, but the short story is that we have a program to be established, and supposedly by January of 2025, we'll start to have paid leave available in the state.
Yeah, fascinating debate, fascinating process for how this all came together. Certainly a flurry of activity at the end of session to get all this wrapped up in time for the General Assembly to override a veto from the governor, which they did. So more to come there. Obviously, Brianna, we're going to post links in the show notes. You have a really good recap of the bill on the Conduit Street blog, so we'll make sure to include that. I want to jump to our next topic of discussion, always a hot topic, school construction. And Brianna, there was a lot of emphasis this session on school construction. We know the past few sessions and maybe a few years ago, we had the big bill to pump tons of money into school constructions to get all these projects going that were sort of sitting there ready to go. What did we get into this past session when it comes to school construction? Because again, that is something that always gets the attention of county governments.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that school construction, as I'm learning more on the general topic, I think that it's always going to be a very hot one that we will never not have interest in for legislative session purposes. But this year in particular was really interesting. And of course, funding of school construction outside of the actual mechanics of what kind of construction build we're doing were definitely hot topics this year. We saw several bills that would have, for example, required locals to fully fund some major remediation and like testing of school facilities for various issues like mold and other things like that. Those were challenges, and there were others to like eliminate any sort of state funding support for traditional energy systems, for example, which is not quite realistic for county needs or abilities at this time, but those sort of bills did not pass. There was nothing major this year that would be detrimental to local government's ability to provide safe and healthy school facilities for our students. So that's great news. That was in large part thanks to MACO's advocacy and really educating legislators on these issues and things like that. What did pass, however, was a major bill stemming from the interim work group on school construction, which we've talked about before on the podcast. MACO had a seat on that board via Frederick County Executive Jan Gardner. That was an interim work group that did a lot of really took a lot of hard looks at how we do school construction as a state, how we want to use things like facility assessments to inform where we are with school maintenance, building maintenance, and things like that, and where we want to go. And so that was really a landmark bill this session, in my opinion. And it really does a lot of good for counties in particular as really the funders and the project managers of school construction and maintenance. Lots in that bill. It was quite a hefty one, but it all stemmed from really healthy debate and discussion during the interim by that work group. Something super, yeah, Michael?
No, I think I want to expand on that for a second and say, Brianna, your write-ups that have been on the blog talking about this bill, I think would be good reading for people who are interested in the deeper details. Like, we don't want to do 30 minutes on go through point by point of what's in the bill, but I would say that school construction is just one of these areas because the state has a coordinating and funding role. We end up with a lot of state level policy to provide incentives for this or bonuses for that, or to say, these kind of projects will get special consideration and so forth. So that's part of the push and pull in the structure that we have in Maryland, where the state has a big active funding role for school projects. That's different than in some other states. There are other places where basically each school district is on its own to build a new school when they need one or to patch over their roof. I think Maryland, for the most part, is doing this wisely And what you end up with is an opportunity for some smarter policies on that front. So if we want to move in the direction of energy efficient school buildings, something we mentioned last week when we were talking about the climate legislation, we've already got the infrastructure and the architecture for that. We've got, carrots and sticks in place to have buildings meet certain standards and so forth. And this bill went even farther in that particular area. But that's a part of the Maryland policy debate, not just where are we spending dollars, but also what are the things that the state's going to recognize. And they have an opportunity to say, hey, your state-county split can be more favorable if you do these various things. That gives the state a lot of policy leverage on what our school buildings end up looking like.
Yeah, that's exactly what this bill did, for sure. And so there are things built into this bill, like those incentives, those carrots for doing things like environmentally friendly builds or, reconstructing your HVAC system to be more environmentally friendly, things like that. But there's also a whole other set of incentives built into the bill for things that are what I'll call more complicating factors, like concentrations of poverty, for example. Or concentrations of English language learners, things like that, where if we have a school that is either, a new build or needing a major renovation and happens to fall into those categories, your state local bump goes up for those sort of incentives, which is really helpful, obviously. The bill also set some guardrails around assessing school facilities and working in particular with the local school systems to better do so. We saw kind of a rocky start to the beginning of the work group simply because there was some issues with school facility assessments and kind of the process really getting that off the ground and how the state was working with locals in collecting that data and things like that. So this bill tries to set some guardrails around not only how the state should be working with the locals to do that in the future, but also then what that data can be used to do. So prioritizing projects, for example, based on the lifeline of a school facility or based on the quality of certain systems, things like that. And something that I'm particularly excited for with this bill, something that we've been talking about for a bit as a real help to local government, is the establishment of a local revolving loan fund and program that would essentially allow our lower debt capacity counties to forward fund both the local share, but also the state share of school construction. So that means we'll have counties able to move forward with projects much sooner than anticipated because of this revolving loan fund. And to that note, there was a pretty hefty state appropriation dedicated to this fund. The number is escaping me at the moment, but I know that it was between 40 and 50 million just for the first year. So some real potential for leverage there. And I think that'll be really useful for a lot of folks.
It's a big deal, and a lot of work went into this. And you mentioned County Executive Gardner. She has been the expert on this issue, representing county governments for many years. So really good news on that front, Brianna. This is something that is going to be a recurring issue as everybody wants to build more schools, modernize schools, make them more energy efficient, et cetera. We're on board for all of that. We just need to make sure that we have the right tools and the right support from the state to make that happen. Along those lines, sticking with education, I want to also talk about, because we are the Conduit Street Podcast and we talk about the blueprint in Kirwan early and often, the Accountability Implementation Board, the AIB. This is building off of the blueprint for Maryland's future. This is how we're going to implement the bill, make sure that everything goes as planned. And so we have this board, and Michael and Brianna, I think you were both involved in AIB and maintenance of effort stuff. That is the amount of money that counties have to put in to their local school systems for operating costs. So Michael and Brianna, let's talk about the AIB and maintenance of effort. I think we can kind of take these two as one subject here as we move along on the podcast. But what was going on with the AIB? I know we talked about that previously, Michael, during session, and maintenance of effort.
Yeah, I can kick off a little bit on the accountability board. If you remember back to the fall, of last year, I think we talked on the podcast, and there was conversation in the headlines about the creation and composition of this oversight board. So it's a statewide panel that is supposed to sort of shepherd things along through this 10-year implementation of the whole Kirwan blueprint plan. And for those of us who were in on the ground floor with the commission and all the work that went into ultimately the creation of that plan, a big part of the thinking behind this initiative was Maryland needs to make sure that the new resources and the new expectations are coming along properly, that we don't end up at the end of 10 years and find out, well, we missed the mark and we should have seen it coming. So the idea of having some oversight was a fairly central principle for a lot of people's, like, as a condition of their support for this big initiative is, I'm willing to put money into it, but I want to make sure that we're seeing the things that we're supposed to see, that we're getting those teachers into that career ladder and advancing in the ways that we want, that the expanded services for our students with special needs are being reached and that we're meeting our targets there, and all those different things that were part of the vision for what do you get out of the blueprint. Let's make sure it's happening in the right way, and we'll need a team of people to oversee that, including a staff and including some sort of audit capacity and reporting capacity and so forth. So that's what this was all about. This isn't a body that's rewriting the laws or redoing the formulas on who gets what dollars or anything. It's just a matter of how's it going on the ground, and is the implementation matching up with the expectations of the policy. Well, there were hiccups in the process of getting to appointing that body. And when applications were received for who wanted to serve, there wasn't the geographic diversity that you might have expected. You might have thought there'd be people from every corner of the state saying, I want to be part of this body. Instead, we had pockets of people from certain parts of the state, but not others. And the selection process with the group of people they had to work with ended up saying, here's our list of candidates. I'm trying to remember how this worked, Brianna. You might remember the details, but I think the bill had a nominating committee recommend something like 9 or 10 people, and then the governor had to select a subset of that list, something like 7 out of 9. Do you remember the specifics?
Correct. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. But
it was a short list to choose from. Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, the governor was handed a list of, I think by most people's judgment, a qualified and respectable group of people, but the pins on the map were kind of consolidated. It's like, a lot in Baltimore and a few from Montgomery, and that's most of it. So, there were folks from the more rural parts of the state and from Prince George's County and from other parts of the state saying it doesn't look like our area is represented, at least as far as the membership of this body goes. Is that right? So we knew that there would be some debate about what would happen there. And then in addition to the geographic representation, just the process, because the Kirwan bill was originally vetoed and overridden, and that took an extra year. Just the process of getting the members appointed and in place and getting them staffed up, it all happened later than expected. So we needed legislation in the 22 session to tidy up the sort of timetables and expectations for what this accountability board was going to do, when they were going to report various things and so forth. So we knew coming into this legislative session that this was going to be something legislature is going to have to refine some timetables and make some changes and at least consider the membership of that body and so forth. So all this stuff was teed up for some legislative conversation. That's fair?
Yeah, it was. And there was some healthy conversation for sure. Unfortunately, we didn't see that particular bill this year move to expand the makeup of the AIB. However, I'll note that there have been a lot of really robust discussions on the AIB itself with the current members on the need to have more representation and to better represent all of Maryland's diverse needs in this huge undertaking. And right. So there's been talk, for example, about possibly assigning not consultants, but folks to really help guide the body that aren't members themselves, but experts from different regions and on different topics that can help guide their thinking and really make sure that all of Maryland's needs are met representatively. But we didn't actually see the legislation go anywhere. And I think that could possibly be simply not wanting to put into law these stipulations of the exact makeup of each member and where they should come from. Maybe that was a little bit too prescriptive for everyone's appetite.
Yeah, I think that's probably the right read, that I think there's sympathy for the idea of getting all regions and perspectives around the table, but maybe there's a solution that's short of a statutory change, that rather than saying this body must have the following 13 people, instead, they might be able to accomplish the same ends by different means. And I wouldn't be surprised to see the body move in that direction with some widespread support. But so Kevin, you were right to tee this up and say that other school funding issues got connected to this. And in the midst of the bill that we knew needed to pass that changed timetables and expectations for the accountability process, we also ended up seeing some clarifications for county funding requirements. We tend to refer to the maintenance of effort, the state law that says the counties need to continue funding per pupil as much as you did the prior year. You can't backtrack on school funding. And I'm doing a lot of work with that short description for what is a big, complicated, and thorny issue that's technical. I love technical stuff, but we'll hold off on that for the moment.
There's plenty
that was a generous description, Michael.
But so the quirky issue this year was the student count in the fall of 2021 still showed lots of school systems down 2, 3, 4, 5% in their student count compared to a couple of years ago. So under the law, you fund per pupil. And if you have 5% fewer students, that theoretically puts on the table that the county could say, well, we're going to cut funding by 5%, but we'll be maintaining our per pupil funding. If those kids are gone forever and they're just not going to be part of the school system, that might be the appropriate thing to do. But if you think that school count is kind of blurry because of lingering pandemic effects, and I think that's a reasonable point of view, then you probably don't want to see school systems get cut proportionally by that student count, because you're not going to lay off 5% of your teachers and get rid of a bunch of school buses and shut down 1 out of every 20 school buildings. You're not doing that. So if we're in a blip, then it makes sense to have the school funding laws avoid a permanent consequence from that blip. What they ended up passing got a little technical and a little complicated, which again, I love technical and complicated, but I'll abbreviate the whole thing a fair amount and just say they came up with a pretty elegant solution to more or less say, if you would have been able to cut funding this year because your population's down, we're going to kind of hold our nose, sort of ignore this year's student count for that purpose, just flat fund the schools at a minimum. And if that means that we've artificially bumped up your dollars per student, like same total dollars divided by fewer students is as if you gave a big bump, we'll exclude that from next year's calculation. So we'll make a 1-year fix to recognize that there's probably a 1-year blip in the enrollment counts. I think that's more or less the right way to tie up the loose ends on what we hope is the tail end of these quirky consequences of the health pandemic that has other consequences like school attendance.
And Michael, that might sound familiar, that 1-year fix, because that's something we've had to do last year as well, right? We knew that we were missing kids. We don't know if they were homeschooled, if they went to private schools, but I think everybody expects that eventually these kids are going to come back to school. And I think you gave a great description. And what they did seemingly makes sense, right? You don't want to cut schools because they've lost enrollment. Those kids, we think, are going to come back. But this is something that we've had to go and adjust for the past few years, right?
That's exactly right. So this is 2 years running. We've had to sort of tie up the formulas and make them work smarter. I mean, you write laws for ordinary circumstances. And then when you have a record scratch moment like a pandemic, suddenly you realize we're not sure we can really put faith in the student counts, even though the law says we're supposed to. So let's patch things over. We'll kind of ignore the September 2020 student counts altogether. And that's basically what the state law now does. And for 21, for this county funding purposes, we'll just have that one-time flat funding requirement. And I don't think that's going to be a hardship for the county governments. It's not going to put anybody in a pickle in future years, but we're going to have the resources to at least flat fund this year. I think everybody's going to be cool with it.
Makes a lot of sense. And Brianna, along these same lines, as you are our education policy expert, I want to also talk about community colleges. We saw a number of bills for community colleges. We know the community colleges here in Maryland are essential for all Marylanders, especially as we hopefully get out of this pandemic. There's going to be a lot of demand for people to change careers, get more training, and what perfect place to do that, community colleges, right? So a number of bills. And the one thing I want to set you up with, Brianna, we know that the state has never lived up to its funding obligation under the CAID formula, right? That's the state funding formula. County governments also are big partners with community colleges. We fund a lot of money to community colleges, and then student tuition. So you have this state, county, student tuition is how we fund our community colleges. The state has never been able to live up to its formula, constantly kicking the can down the road. What did we see this session? There's some movement there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad that you're bringing up community colleges, Kevin, because I truly think that this is one of the most important things to happen this session for counties as supporters of our community colleges, like you said. And so for the first time ever, community colleges were fully funded in the governor's proposed budget. Listeners may have heard that funding referenced as CAID. You just mentioned it as CAID, or the CAID formula, if you will. Kevin. And so they'll be happy to hear that the formula is fully funded for the first time ever. The governor actually put it right in his proposed budget, and then the legislature maintained that. So this is really not only obviously good operationally, our community colleges need the money, but it's also just very symbolic of the state finally living up to really prioritizing community colleges as being high quality institutions for higher education. In particular, this funding formula ties community college funding to a percentage of what the state provides our four-year institutions. And so this is really a great symbol of showing, our community colleges and the students and the professionals that attend and work at them are just as important and just as valuable as those at our four-year institutions. And so that funding is in next year's budget. That's absolutely great. We will have to return next year and to make sure that, that funding level is maintained. I think that it's pretty routine that every session we see a bill to make sure that it's fully funded. That bill gets, to various degrees through chambers and whatnot, but it was not passed this year by any means because it was included in the governor's budget. So we'll have to see what we're working with next year. It'll be a whole new administration. So there's obviously going to be a political dynamic to that as well. But one way or another, we'll definitely hope that funding is maintained. And for now, especially as we're coming out of the pandemic and we see just how critical community colleges are, they're flexible, they are accessible and affordable. And they'll be key, I think, to a healthy recovering economy and an educated population for the state.
And Michael, I think this goes back to another one of our favorite rabbit holes, right? The Budget Reconciliation Financing Act, the BRFA. The community colleges are fully funded, but that's because the state formula statute says that they need to be. And the governor did not put in a BRFA, which is, again, how the companion bill to the budget typically that sort of makes things work, and the governor can propose cuts there to balance the budget. Mm-hmm. We didn't see a BRFA. And so, yes, community colleges are fully funded because that's what state law says, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
That's more or less how it came together. The story of how these things take sometimes longer than expected is interesting. I don't want to beat it to death, but I've lost track of how many years ago it was that the current version of the CADE formula, this program that's named after a longtime legislative champion, Jack Cade was a senator on the Budget and Tax Committee and was influential in a lot of ways, but really committed to two-year schools. And the CADE formula basically said the right thing to do, we know, is to pin the support for our two-year schools, basically use the foundation of the way we support our four-year schools and pin B to A, right? But when you do that, typically as a legislative compromise, you say, well, we have an aspirational goal and we want to get all the way to B should be 29% of A. And that's more or less what the CADE formula said. And it was originally passed, I don't even know how many years, 10, 15 years ago, maybe, with a multi-year phase-in, as political processes are wont to do. We'll get there over some stretch of time. But as it turned out, and this is, governors of both parties and fiscal circumstances all over the place, you get to a certain spot, and this is the year where you're supposed to jump by a full percent or 0.75% in that ratio. And it turns out part of the budget reconciliation plan for a lot of those years was, we can't afford our jump this year. Let's just extend it out. Instead of doing it this year, we'll push everything back one more year. Well, when you have a sequence of incremental decisions driven by challenging budget circumstances in the moment, your 6-year phase-in can turn into 8, 10, 12, 14 years or whatever. I can't cite chapter and verse as to when this formula was adopted, but it's been a long time.
I almost think
coming.
It was the late 90s, Michael. Almost, yeah. It's been a while.
Right. So but that's what we're talking about. Is this has been, everybody knew the right place to be, and nobody really differed with the theory behind it. It was just a matter of taking that next step in every given incident year has proven tough. And when you have a vehicle, this big, cudgel like a budget reconciliation bill that says we're going to make all 25 changes in this bill to make this year's fiscal plan pass, you kind of have to vote for the budget reconciliation bill. That's the only way the whole thing comes together. So it's not that people kept saying, you know what, we kind of on the sly hate our community colleges. No one was saying that. It was rather, well, we needed to solve a $240 million problem this year. This is the bill that does it. And sorry, like 11 million of that comes out of the community colleges. They won't get the bump they were anticipating. Right? We saw that lots of times over past years. This is the year we put the bow on it and finally get to the goal. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, 1996 was when the CADE formula was established. So many, many years now that we've been dealing with this. And of course, when state funding lags, pressure builds on counties and student tuition. No one wants that to happen. But as you said, Michael, it's hard to vote against the BRFA because that's what you need to make the budget work. So thankfully, we didn't see that this year. We're really excited for our community colleges, our partners. We are huge fans and advocates for our community colleges. So really great news there when it comes to community college funding. More work to do, as you said, Brianna, but I'm really excited about that one. And I think it's the right thing to do. It took a long time to get here, but here we are. I know that the folks at the community colleges are excited. Their association is excited. So overall, great news for them.
And this is support for the institutions, but it also, we should understand that central support from the state government and from the counties is the way to make sure that the offerings at your two-year schools are affordable to a really wide range of people. I mean, that's one of the main assets of community colleges as a framework for higher education. So to the extent that the state has not been able to live up to its share, we've ended up with the squeeze is on tuition. And the people who participate, who want to take classes, who want to advance themselves in the workforce or in education. So this is an opportunity that's going to translate for the people who want to get those classes and want to move ahead. And that's a good thing too.
And that's a really important point, Michael. I think especially as we're putting this all in the COVID context and we are experiencing what folks are calling the Great Resignation, and to have community colleges be a bridge for people to get into the healthcare field, to get into teaching where we have such a shortage of professionals, and things like that, really making sure that we can maintain accessibility and affordability are key. And this is one way to do so.
All right. So Brianna, while we have you here, is there anything else that we didn't cover? Some of the major policy issues that you worked on during the 22 session? I think we hit the big ones, but any final thoughts on this session? It was a weird one, of course. We talked with our colleague Dominic last week about his feelings about how things came together, sine die. But I want to make sure we didn't miss any of your big policy issues, and then I'll get your thoughts on session generally, especially as we wound down and got to sine die.
Yeah, it was a great and strange session at the same time. I look forward to hopefully next year being completely back to a normal routine with in-person hearings and committee sessions and all of that good stuff. But it was definitely, I think, an interesting and a major session to make my reemergence into Annapolis. And I was so happy to do it with y'all and for local government.
Yes, and we're happy to have you. It was a great session for Mako. Michael, any final closing thoughts from you before we wrap up today?
I think all these issues are interesting, and a couple of times today we had to cut off a conversation that could have been its own 20 or 30-minute rabbit hole. But kudos to Brianna for riding herd over some of these tricky issues, and a couple of things that she just waved away and said, there was a challenging bill and it didn't pass, and that's good, and so forth. That's a good deal of what the county governments need to do in the policy process, is talk about the implementation level, talk about what things would be a challenge locally and that sort of thing. Carrots and sticks and so forth have their place, but we sometimes need to step up and say, hey, this idea is more than you're bargaining for, and here's why. So that's a big part of the county role in the state legislative process, and I think we got a lot of that done this year. I'm happy about it.
All right, so as Michael said, we had a lot of conversation that could have gone on and on. We will make sure to post links in the show notes. You can read more about all the things that we talked about today there, but we will leave it there for this week. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, the Conduit Street blog. But for Brianna January and Michael Sanderson, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.